You're on.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Seventh Generation Interfaith Coalition for Responsible Investment webinar on corporate governance. We are delighted to have you with us this morning and delighted as well to have our guests who will be accompanying us through this conversation. As you know, everybody's been placed on mute, and at the question and answer time, you'll be able to unmute yourselves to ask questions. So you're in listen mode until then. And again, after this webinar, we will have the recording and slides available to all the participants. That can be found on our website. One final point on that, we'll be sending out an evaluation, and we really appreciate any kind of input you can give us to help continue enhancing and refining these webinars that we do with our members. Without further ado then, maybe we'll move into a moment of reflection. I remember hearing once upon a time a phrase that we're only as sick as our secrets. You know, that I think is true both personally, but also institutionally. And sometimes we find that corruption can breed within institutions around the kinds of secrets that they conceal. And even in the scriptures, in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus had a few things to say about those things. He said in chapter 12, "There is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, nor secret that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the darkness will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered behind closed doors will be proclaimed on the housetops." Now, that may sound a bit adrift in a way from often what we might be otherwise thinking about with respect to our engagement with as shareholders with companies. But in fact, it seems pertinent because of the kinds of things that happen in companies at times and the work that we do in corporate governance to guide companies to a more transparent relationship, both with shareholders and with the public at large. Today, we're going to be examining the kinds of efforts that shareholders take in that regard. And it's fundamentally with the belief that individuals and institutions work better in transparency. So accompanying us in this conversation this morning, we have our two steady pros on this issue. We have both with us John Keenan and Tim Smith. John is the corporate governance analyst for capital strategies for the American Federation of State, Community, County, and Municipal Employees, otherwise known as AFSCME. It's the largest union in the AFL-CIO that represents state and local government, healthcare, and childcare workers. He serves on the board of the Council of Institutional Investors and previously chaired its shareholder advocacy committee. Before joining AFSCME, he was also working with ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services. And also we have with us Tim Smith, who is, in addition to the title that you see there of Senior Vice President, he is Director of Environmental, Social, and Governance Shareholder Engagement at Boston Trust Walden Asset Management. And in addition to his work there, previously Tim had served as Executive Director of ICCR for 24 years. Both deeply steeped in the work of shareholder advocacy, but especially in this area then of corporate governance. And without further ado, maybe I'll pass it on to them to lead us, just to kind of walk through a little of the overall agenda. We'll be talking initially about what is corporate governance, and John will be guiding us through some of that. And then some conversation about money and influence in politics with Tim guiding us in that, although I suspect that there will be a fair amount of interplay between the two in the midst of it. And then we'll talk a little bit about SGI's engagement in those areas with reflections from Brother Robert Watipka, Ann Roberts, and Sister Ruth Battaglia. And then we'll have, at the end, some question and answer. And again, we'll pass it on then to John Keenan.
Wonderful. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
What excellent. So thank you. And I'm really glad to be here. Again, I'm John Keenan, and I'm a corporate governance analyst with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And kind of just going to give a rundown on what we do, why we have a shareholder program, and how corporate governance affects the investments of our members' pension funds. So again, we represent public service workers who are state employees, county, municipal, and all throughout the country, and they are members of public pension funds. So they are basically invested in the markets, and their deferred wages, which are their going to pay for their retirement, those are their assets and it's their money. And how that gets handled and how it's supposed to work is basically based on the premise that their workers' money should represent their interests. And within that, the value of the pension funds and them making their returns and being invested in a way that is for the long term fits in with the horizon and kind of the thinking of pension funds. We're long-term investors. We own the market, and basically we need the market to do well to provide sustainable returns. But then at the same time, what's going on with our investments, and are they representing workers, interests and their best interests and their values? So how do you get that, and why is that important, and how do you actually go about it? The other thing is we have there's the AFSCME Employees Pension Plan, and that's the pension plan for staff members such as myself. And through that, we have engaged in active shareholder engagement, basically to engage the markets and look at things overall. So to the next slide, corporate governance. Basically, corporate governance is a system where it's how do you interact with the markets? How are companies overseen? You buy the shares, but then you're empowering the directors to act on shareholder and stakeholders' best interests. And then as owners, you monitor. And that monitoring process, you elect the directors, you vote on things like executive pay. This is called proxy voting. Every year, the shareholders get to have a say on how they think the company is being managed. And for the most part, if a company is being managed well, there's, a few issues raised, whatever, but you elect the directors, you ratify the auditors, you look at the pay, and it's a way to interact between the shareholders having a voice with the board of directors, which oversees the management. So how this all interacts basically is a system of accountability. And looking at how companies are run is important because well-run companies produce better returns, produce longer-term value, and then ones that aren't as well run actually can harm value and have bad things happen, and also have a company that's not behaving well, treating its workers poorly, not looking at the supply chain. There's some reputational risk, but as a long-term pension fund, we basically own the market. So it's not like, hey, we're just going to walk away from a problem and say, yeah, we'll do the Wall Street walk. No, we're actually going to look to engage to increase the value of our investments and the holdings and look at ways that can happen. So yeah, to the next slide, basically a shareholder program is based on the premise that good corporate governance leads to better shareholder value and longer term value and sustainable value. There's something called the CalPERS effect. CalPERS is the largest public pension fund in the United States with over $300 billion. It's the California Public Employees Retirement System. And they have engaged in a program where they look at underperforming companies that have bad corporate governance, and instead of walking away and doing nothing, they have actually engaged with the board of directors, suggested ways that they can improve accountability to shareholders, and rolled up their sleeves and made suggestions. And it's been shown that it actually, in the time after their engagement, it adds 12% in returns to those companies. So you can take underperforming companies that have bad governance and engage and create better value. So that's just kind of the thinking of why we do this and why it's important. So then to the next slide. The active shareholder. So this is the shareholder as Superman, like shareholder battles the vile corruption of the fat cats, executive pay that is so signifying of when things are wrong, kind of a system that's out of whack. So what can shareholders do? And this kind of gets into, we talked about proxy voting, and there's management proposals where you elect the directors and you vote on an advisory thing to approve the management's pay. But as shareholders, you can also raise issues through the shareholder proposal process. So if you own $2,000 worth of shares for a year, you can file a resolution to address some corporate governance issues and other issues that affect the company and raise them with management as a shareholder and try to address some of these things. So can we go to kind of the next slide and kind of just get into some of these topics? So corporate governance topics. Before you see independent chair, majority vote standard, proxy access, board diversity, say on pay, risk management, political spending disclosure, and shareholder rights. I'm going to kind of run through these and just say how they affect shareholders, accountability, management, the runnings of a corporation. So basically, the board of directors is set up to oversee management. The chairperson of a board oversees the board. So the board oversees the executives. That includes the CEO. However, in the U.S. markets, oftentimes we have a unitary role where the chairman most times winds up being the CEO. So what you have is a case where the executive, the top person, is overseeing the management body that oversees his job and his role. So it can kind of lead to problems. So the best practice is to say, hey, we think you should have an independent board leadership, independent chair. Majority vote standard. This gets to the election of directors, and it says that directors need to be reelected to the board by a majority of shareholder votes. They used to have a standard in place called the plurality voting standard, where as long as a director got one shareholder vote, they were reelected. And it's absurd that if everyone votes against a director or withheld their vote, that person would be seated, and it just lessens accountability if directors aren't accountable. So a majority vote standard says, hey, you have to get a majority of the actual votes, and it's an accountability mechanism. Proxy access, this means access to the shareholder proxy and the ability to nominate directors. This is like one of the biggest things because a board of directors is an insular group oftentimes that's self-perpetuating where they nominate people they know, all that kind of stuff. And shareholders aren't allowed to suggest a director who would bring a different background and perhaps a perspective, say, on climate at an energy company that is missing. And with proxy access, what that means is that shareholders holding a certain amount of shares can suggest a director nominee and have it placed on the management's proxy materials, which is what everyone votes to, elect directors, and it's really groundbreaking. And in the case of a company that's underperforming, shareholders can come in and say, hey, we need somebody else on the board. Say on pay, that's just a shorthand for the advisory vote on executive compensation. It's advisory, so it doesn't have any binding effect, but it shows how shareholders feel. And with just runaway CEO pay and executives making over 400 times their workers, sometimes 1,000 times, we see that now with this new disclosure. Shareholders are able to say, no, we think that's out of control, and we're voting against the pay, and it needs to be tied to performance more, and that's not a good thing. Risk management, very important. The board needs to be making sure that they're overseeing, let's say with JP Morgan and the financial crisis, they had a failure of risk management. Very, very important. Lobbying, political spending, Tim's going to get into that, but it's basically how is the company spending money? How is it being overseen? Is there disclosure of it? Is there reputational risk if a company is making controversial contributions? And, if it's being done in the best interest of shareholders, why shouldn't they disclose it? So there's shareholders bring this forward and say, hey, we'd like to see disclosure on this. And it's a very important shareholder topic these days that is going on. And then finally, shareholder rights. Like, this is very important. Getting back to majority voting, just the ability, I'll just raise one that's just a huge, huge issue, and it really takes away shareholder rights. And this company's coming forward with what's called a dual class structure. So they have two types of shares, and the insiders and the founders of the company have a super voting, we'll call them Class B, where they get 10 shares for every regular shareholder's 1 vote. And they set it up so that they have a majority of the voting power. So at Facebook and Google, you can say, hey, I think you guys need a little more accountability and you need some more disclosure. Well, the founders actually own 70% of the shares, and that means that basically shareholders are lacking in accountability. So we can try to raise things through engagement and dialogue and proposals, but management can always vote it down, and they're the final say. So with that, I don't want to talk too much, but I hope that kind of gives a overview and synopsis of some of these issues. And with that, I'll pass it back to Chris and then to Tim.
Great. Thank you, John. That's a wonderful overview. And maybe Tim will pass it on to you to kind of deepen some of what we've begun to speak about today. Oh.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure. So this is Tim Smith, and I work in Boston with a firm, Walden Asset Management and Boston Trust. I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation. I think back, of course, whenever I am engaging with 7th generation members to the founding of the coalition with Mike Crosby in the early 1970s. And I have fond memories of that. And I always think of Mike as we read any changes in the tobacco industry's fortunes. And I send him an email because I know he's smiling down on us. Thank you again for all the ongoing work that we do together as well. And the goals for my comments here is to share some information about what's happening on political spending and lobbying, and to talk about some recent developments, and then to encourage some of you to join in these efforts. And that will be, I think, underlined by Sister Ruth and Ann and Brother Robert, who are going to testify a little about what's been happening. I guess the overall statement, which is pretty clear for all of us as the election is in front of us, the role of companies in affecting elections or affecting public policy and regulations is being discussed as never before. It's a tremendously important topic. It is very related to almost all of the issues that we all work together on through 7th generation. I'll just define these two different ways. One, there's the issue of political spending, how companies or individuals, it could be, are involved in putting money into electing or supporting the election of certain candidates for office. So we call that political spending. And then lobbying would be more trying to affect public policy, try to affect a law or a regulation. We have a division of labor to get this work done with some great partners. We appear together at ICCR meetings. A group in Washington called the Center for Political Accountability has been doing advocacy in this political spending work for over a dozen years. And they have about, I think last year, John, they had over 50 shareholder resolutions focusing on political spending disclosure, and with some good successes. And John and I coordinate the work for ICCR and other investors on lobbying. And we're looking at the ways companies affect public policy. And we have, in the last couple of years, have had shareholder resolutions, about 30 to 50 shareholder resolutions a year. We've been doing this work on lobbying since 2011, and there have been about, John is a great statistician, and he reckons that we've had about 400 resolutions. You've seen these resolutions, you know what we asked for. I'm not going to go over it in great detail, but we're asking companies to disclose their spending, disclose the oversight that the board and top management has, to disclose who they're providing monies to for lobbying. For example, what trade associations or supposedly charitable organizations like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, who are they giving money to? We're asking them to put this up on their website, including how they review and evaluate their lobbying and political spending. This is not unimportant. This is pretty powerful money, as you all know. I think, John, if we add up what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has spent since over the last 20 years, it's been about $200 billion. So they are significant players. They are powerful voices, and they are very big with money in politics. Fortunately, we can point to the combined work that we've all done, having had some good impact. We have dozens of companies that have expanded their lobbying disclosure, and some that we think do pretty good disclosure: Raytheon, ATT, IBM, 3M, Accenture, Conoco, just to mention a few. John has a long list, for example. So this is not just a theoretical conversation, of course, because right now companies are working very hard on impacting public policy directly or through trade associations. So today, for example, you're going to read in the papers that the Trump administration is trying to lessen the regulations on methane gas emissions, even though they're such a toxic contributor to climate change. And here they are trying to lessen them. And the API, the American Petroleum Institute, big trade association for oil and gas companies, very actively supporting that. Ironically, companies like Exxon and a number of other oil companies have said they don't want the regulations to be significantly diminished. Why? Because they want an even playing field here. They want to be, they've done a lot of work to control their methane emissions, and they want that to continue and everybody else to have to play too. So these are real issues that we're facing, methane and climate change being one. But let's talk briefly about another that we're all involved in, and I'll encourage you all, maybe Frank and Christopher, we can send around a reminder for folks to join in an open letter to the Securities Exchange Commission on our shareholder resolution rights. So here we, for 50 years, we, the faith community and other investors, have been involved in using the proxy process to raise important issues like lobbying or climate change or diversity, corporate governance, of course. And we have trade associations like the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, who are vigorously trying to promote new restrictions on the ability to file resolutions. And in doing so, they make up a lot of stories about how these issues aren't important for companies' profitability, and the sponsors are special interest groups with a political agenda. So we have been pushing back vigorously against this narrative, but we need to raise our voices as never before to try to protect ourselves. But I'm using that as an example because here is where the trade association's lobbying is trying to counter our work together to impact companies. I'll mention one other, and then we can turn into discussion, and that is the issue of climate change. And we've been working on that. ICCR members have been working on this for 25 years. But this year, we're going to have a group of investors. I think many of you have been invited to join in supporting a letter to major companies about their climate-related lobbying. So what we're saying is companies, of course, have every legal right to lobby, and many companies, by the way, are lobbying in ways that we give them credit for. Many companies supported the U.S. staying in the Paris Accord, for example, on climate change. But this letter is taking a page from a strategy used in Europe, led in part by the Church of England. And this strategy calls on companies to make a commitment to have all their lobbying be consistent with the goals of the Paris Accord. In other words, trying to make sure any policy they supported was moving toward no more increase in temperature past 1.5 degrees. But more important than just asking a company to do it, we're asking them to push their trade associations to do it. Well, that's a stretch to ask them to make sure that the chamber and others are lobbying consistent with Paris too. But apparently it's not an impossible stretch. In Europe, already a dozen companies have agreed to this pledge, and Shell Oil has not only made the pledge, but has done a review of 19 major trade associations they're part of, and giving them marks basically on their climate lobbying, and withdrew from one trade association and have put others on watch. So we believe it's not an impossible ask, it's a stretch, but it's a very important one as we work on climate change, because we need strong public policy, and we need companies either to support strong public policy or stop lobbying against it. My last point is an example of how this work plays out, and we're going to hear from Sister Ruth and Ann and Brother Robert in a second. And that is a story about Sister Barbara Jennings, who's been a faithful attendee of Emerson Electric stockholders meeting in St. Louis, where she's based. And she's attended meetings for us for a number of years, often moving resolutions on lobbying disclosure or on sustainability reporting. This last year, she went to the meeting. She commended the company for a number of changes they've made, but then challenged one of the board members. And the board member was the head of the Business Roundtable. And she challenged him on the grounds that they were lobbying against our right to file resolutions. He was polite enough to come up afterward, have a conversation with her, and said, I'd be glad to have a call with some of the concerned investors. So Sister Barbara and ICCR set that up, and we did have a meeting on phone. No progress yet, but nonetheless, the door was open to talk. And it's an example of how engagement on lobbying at least got some results. So Christopher and Frank, I'll leave it there. I know we've got lots more to say about this topic, but we'll turn to our other co-presenters to do that. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you, Tim. And maybe just to follow up, you made the comment about the Church of England. It's worth knowing that yesterday, the Archbishop of Canterbury actually made a statement regarding climate and investments. And one of the phrases he used was, he said, passive investment may be the right investment solution for many, but passive stewardship is the answer for no one. All investors can make a difference by engaging and voting determinably in support of the Paris Agreement. So they've kind of redoubled their efforts precisely around that issue.
Great quote. Please, let's spread that one far and wide, isn't it? Yeah.
We will be doing so. So maybe now what we hope to hear are three of our members who've been working with Tim and with John on engagements around lobbying. And maybe we'll start with Brother Robert Watipka of the St. Joseph Province of the Capuchin Order, and talking about a company that makes airplanes and other things known as Boeing. Brother Robert, let's pull you off of mute.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. I am the successor and in no way the replacement for Michael Crosby, corporate responsibility agent for the Capuchin Franciscan Province of St. Joseph. And I manage the activist fund and overlook it that Mike created for the province. I long for the day when all of the province's assets are activated and invested with a view toward responsibility. And as a member of the province's Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Commission, I'm working for that day. But for now, I've got my little pot of money and I use it the best I can with the help of my brothers and sisters who carry me. And I really should turn it right back to John Keenan for the Boeing engagement, because John did everything right down to scripting me, except for one joke, which I led with when I went into the Boeing General Shareholders Meeting, April 29th. A horrifically rainy day. I stood in front of the $31 million man with soggy shoes, and I called him to account. The shareholder resolution I filed was done at the initiative of John Keenan. Basically, an email went out, I think, in November. Does anybody hold Boeing? We want to refile the corporate governance the lobbying disclosure resolution. And I said, without consulting Frank Sherman and Chris, my mentors, yeah, I hold it, I'll do it. And we filed, and and messed up Frank's timeline and delegation of responsibilities. But tragically, after that filing, the second 737 MAX crash occurred. The first was in October. We filed in November. The second crash was in March. And in the weeks leading up to the shareholder investing, into the AGM, I was contacted by the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and agency France Press. And I believe that they were all looking for, forgive the metaphor, a bloody shirt to say, what are you going to do about the MAX? And of course, the MAX wasn't what provoked our filing, but it's illustrative of why the shareholder resolution world is so vital, because as the count was walked back in the post-crash investigations, I heard some words maybe they were new to you too: regulatory capture, and insourcing of the certification process. And all these things are brought to the public consciousness through the media, and brought to the consciousness of the board of directors through the shareholder activist movement. I took the train down to Chicago on that rainy morning. My mouth was dry and my knees were knocking. And the result was a bump. And I was told by my mentors that this was a really significant bump from a 24% approval on the lobbying disclosure resolution of 2018 to a 32% approval on the lobbying disclosure resolution for 2019. And I met some activists who were protesting on the sidewalk outside, and I was accused, I must say, oh, I can't believe that you hold Boeing, a weapons manufacturer, on my way in and on my way out. How did it go? What did you hear? What did they say? So it takes many, everybody has to have all these tools in their toolbox to hold corporations accountable. And I'll march in the street. I tend to attract a lot of attention, but I'm very thankful for the opportunity to go inside too that Mike helped found.
Thank you, Brother Robert. And why don't we ask Ann Roberts now to speak a little bit about Bank of America and her experience of filing the resolution there.
Good morning. I can say we relied heavily on Tim Smith with this engagement, but we started from, we chose Bank of America because it was on John's list of companies that needed to be filed with. And, but I think we made the mistake in that this was the resolution was the first contact we made with the company. And that kind of set us, I think, a little bit on the wrong foot, and the contact there kind of scolded me about it. So that was a lesson learned, that not to let the resolution be the first contact. But we had several, email exchanges and conversations. And again, Tim was very much helpful with the wording of my emails, and I consulted him quite a bit, and he was part of the conversation throughout, and we were able to come to an agreement with the company. They did not give much, but they did give some, and I felt like the door was open there for more conversation, and that withdrawing the resolution would be beneficial to that relationship. So that's what we did, and we have had a couple of conversations, just casual conversations, but we're trying to set up an in-person meeting in New York the week of the ICCR meeting to continue this discussion and to push for more concessions on their side, more disclosure.
Thanks, Ann. I mean, it's exciting to see both the kinds of learnings from these sorts of things about, like, for instance, that dialogue is maybe a great place to begin, although sometimes it does require the resolution to get their attention. Somebody else who would have an experience then to speak along those lines, actually, and quite similar start to it would be Sister Ruth and her experience with a small little company in Southern California known as the Walt Disney Corporation?
Well, I would not like Robert that I jumped in with great enthusiasm to do this, but Frank is quite persuasive. So I agreed because it was going to be very simple. And I guess I have to say it has been. I don't know if Frank and Chris expect me to talk about my panic in terms of when I got a call, email like 2 days after the resolution arrived that they wanted to have a call. So I was grateful to Chris, who, after I sent out my message of panic, called me on the phone and talked me out of my panic. And I have to say that after that, then things went really quite smoothly in getting together the people on the phone conversation, which of course were Tim Smith, John Keenan, Abby McCoy, who was co-filing, and Christopher. So they can testify that I think I said hello and goodbye in the conversation, but that just as Tim said earlier, our ask was kind of the usual ask, that the shareholders were asking that there be more transparency in their lobbying, both direct and indirect, and grassroots lobbying communications, that that the payments would be specific, that we would know how much they're contributing, and then that there would be board oversight. The company called us rather quickly because they were eager to share with what they had done. And so it was Pat Tomiano, I'd say it right, from Zevin Asset Management, who had filed previously, who was the lead filer, and I had co-filed. And so he really had laid a lot of groundwork, so they were eager to share with us, you know, the progress that they had made, and we were pretty happy with it, except for the fact that that they did not have an upper cap that for their spending, they're disclosing what they spent. So we don't know if they were contributing a very small amount or a very large amount. And basically what we were asking them to do is to be sure that what they say as their policy also is reflected in their action, so that they were on a board with the Paris Peace Accord. And Tim can correct me if I'm wrong, but they contributed lots of money to this Chamber of Commerce, which was not. So Timothy, I thought, made a great presentation about how the power that these companies have for the good, and that more and more stakeholders are asking companies to be on board with some of the values, particularly climate change and similar things. And so we have plans for another phone call. We did send about 8 points after our initial dialogue. We sent them 8 points that we would hope they would consider. We said that we were considering withdrawing the resolution. And so we have been asked to have another conference call, another call with Disney, see what they have come up with. They promised that they would take it into consideration. So we're eager to hear if they have accepted any of the other points that we proposed.
Thank you, Sister Ruth. I mean, I'll add this. Like Sister Ruth sent an email the other day, and this major corporation got back to her within 2 hours of the initial email, which kind of says how important the kinds of things that she's raising are to them and how prompt they are at responding to these issues. And it speaks how important it is. I think one of the things you heard from all three of them, both Brother Robert and Sister Ruth, also is the great support in these resolutions that we've gotten from Tim and from John. In other words, if you have not filed a resolution before, filing one of these resolutions you can count on Natalie and Frank and I to work with you hand in hand. But our ace in the hole in many ways is having Tim and John on our side. And if you've never filed before, this could be actually a really great way of beginning to file a resolution and learn more about this process. John, Tim, how about some initial reactions to what you heard from Brother Robert, from Ann, and Sister Ruth?
Yeah, hey, if I can start, I think this is just kind of a great laying of the foundation that has been set, and kind of the overall coalition work, and kind of the Rome was not built in a day aspect of our work. This is not a sprint, but it's a marathon. So for Sister Ruth's engagement with Walt Disney, this may be the 5th time or 6th time that this is being raised, and they finally, slowly but surely, through this campaign and this work, companies are saying, oh, wait a second, we see that more companies are disclosing, and we get your point more, whereas at the beginning they maybe were a little more standoffish. And with Brother Robert and Boeing, it really just kind of captured, what was going on with the company and these problems, and regulatory capture is a great word. And, the lobbying that they spent on safety, did that have an effect on something that now has resulted in, tragedy, but then loss of shareholder value and a lot of work. And then, just with Bank of America, again, it's just kind of, knocking on the door on a regular basis. So, and in terms of the overall work, in 8 years, the proposals have gone from receiving 25% support to this last year, we made it over 30. So slowly but surely, these things start to kind of gain a momentum of themselves. So it's just a matter of continuing to push and to keep raising these issues. And over time, the listening gets a little better.
I can add just another point, a big picture point, that we have a number of members from the coalition that are involved in these resolutions. But the good news is we have some fairly large investors that have been proactively involved too, like the state of New York pension funds, or the city of New York pension funds, or the state of Connecticut or state of Rhode Island pension funds. So the benefit of our coalition is we can speak to the fact that we have a broad cross-section of religious investors, foundations, pension funds that are raising these questions with companies. And the reason I said that I thought our work was more important than ever before is because some of the topics on the table are so timely, from our rights to file resolutions to the work we're doing on climate change. And I think that companies are being held accountable for what their trade associations do as never before too. A lot of companies basically say, we're members of lots of trade associations, doesn't mean they speak for us. And fair enough. Well, I understand that, Pfizer may be a member of a trade association for 20 reasons, and climate change isn't one of those reasons. But nonetheless, investors and the public, stakeholder groups are knocking on company doors and saying, well, but what about all this money you give to trade association X or Y? It's your money, it's your reputation. They say they speak for you. Please step up and hold them accountable and ask them to change their position. So I think that's why the timeliness of these pieces of work on lobbying are so important. Last point is our resolutions on lobbying are pretty general, like it's a similar ask to every company. But in every case that we can in the supporting statement, we mention specifics, like if a company is a member of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that's such a large player at the state level trying to affect policy, all on very, very conservative agendas, or their involvement in the Business Roundtable on the work on shareholder resolutions. So companies are paying more attention to the fact that their trade associations are under scrutiny. And I think it's not a request that falls on deaf ears anymore. Just a thought or two anyway.
Thanks, Tim.
So Chris,
Go ahead, Frank.
I have now unmuted or did the general unmute for our participants, so anyone can unmute themselves to ask a question. And since I've already opened the lines, I will I'll jump in the pool here and ask my question, and it's to both John and Tim. Because I think John mentioned this CalSTRS effect, and that better corporate governance has led to better financial results, according to CalSTRS in their years of active shareholder engagement. I guess my question is, we are advocating for better disclosure, and so do we have any evidence or correlation between disclosure and better ethics or less money in politics? In other words, company can have complete open disclosure and still try to put undue influence on our political system, perhaps for their own always in their own self-interest. And so how does disclosure impact that?
Can you hear me? Good. One of the things we can simply say is, if you measure it and disclose it, you're more apt to manage it. So I agree with you that just disclosing things doesn't mean that a company is changing its posture in terms of lobbying. But it does mean probably that if they have a position, for example, a position that's a positive one on climate change, that therefore they're more apt to say, gee, we do have this disconnect, or as John calls it, a misalignment between our values and our positions and our trade associations. We're going to talk to the trade association about it. So for example, and I'm not trying to build this up too much, but over 20 companies who have decent positions on climate change actually went to the Chamber of Commerce and asked them both to set up a committee that would deal with it, but to come out with a new policy on climate change. Well, the Chamber did. It had some very positive aspects to it. Of course, now we need to watch what the Chamber is doing in light of this policy and whether their lobbying changes. But believe me, in Washington today, with the administration taking more of a climate denier stance, it is not unimportant to be able to walk into a senator's office and say, by the way, the Chamber of Commerce thinks climate change is a real crisis and needs to be addressed. And it is human activity that caused it, and we need to have Congress be proactive. So I think that we can sometimes see influence that we can't put our finger on directly, like Sister Ruth did with regard to Disney. Here's what we asked for, here's the change. But sometimes we've been knocking on a company's door or companies' doors for 20 years, and now the Chamber is making some changes because of pressure from their members. What would you add, John?
Yeah, just what gets disclosed gets managed. To Frank's point, disclosing it may not necessarily stop, but it'll give the fact that it will be disclosed will give pause and thought and make sure that there's a rational thought process behind it, and really to kind of get at the trade association spending and the values alignment. It's not enough for a company to say, climate's very important and we believe all these good things if they're funding the group that undoes all those good things. And the way that kind of the trade association, what I call influence laundering, works is that a company will give the money to a trade association, which then lobbies on a controversial issue, and the company is not its payment to that trade association does not get disclosed unless through our work they decide to disclose it. So it really kind of becomes this avenue for kind of money and spending to influence things that doesn't leave fingerprints. And so the disclosure of that kind of sets up a disinfectant approach where a company will make sure that they're not doing something left hand, right hand kind of thing that results in this values misalignment that we're talking about.
Or even moving the example outside of climate, in the pharmaceutical world, we all know that there are concerns about the costs of pharmaceuticals, and yet some of the pharmaceutical companies support patient advocacy organizations. And so that, for instance, a group that's about, say, a particular illness, a particular kind of treatment, may be getting funding from a pharmaceutical company, and that may influence the kinds of things they're saying. I'm not sure if that gets qualified, if that's a charitable contribution, Tim, John, or if that's something that would be considered a trade association contribution. Can you give me clarity on that?
Sure. On the patient advocacy groups, so there's different kinds of spending, and some of this does wind up falling into charitable groups, so 501c3. So some of these patient advocacy groups that have maybe not helped with drug pricing or not helped with the dangers of the opioid crisis. This is coming out. But then there's also social welfare groups. They're 501c4s. They are allowed to lobby, and that spending is often similar to that of trade associations, which are 501c6s. So it's a technical tax designation, but within looking at this long enough, you start to learn the avenues that the spending goes through and how it kind of affects public policy and other things. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, John. Other questions from our members?
I have a question. One of the reasons really why Dana, my firm, has gotten really behind this topic behind lobbying is because it touches on so many issues, which we learned from at an ICCR conference a couple of years ago. Tim or John, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Beyond climate, just how lobbying.
I can start, and then Tim can fill in. Sure. Drug pricing. There's been drug pricing initiatives in California and Ohio. And PhRMA, which is the trade association for the pharmaceutical companies, spent over $100 million, and that was all pharmaceutical company payments, to defeat this fair drug pricing initiative to lower drug prices for residents of California. And yet the companies say, we support lower drug pricing. So you see, on one hand, they say, hey, we're for this, and then they're against it. The climate thing is one that is just very obvious. Shareholder rights, what are we missing, Tim?
Well, we started off by saying every single issue ICCR members work on to talk about how companies try to affect public policy. Could be on the work that a couple of orders are doing on the issue of guns and gun safety. It could be, as John said, drugs or opioid addiction. It could be whenever whenever a position is being presented by the administration, for example, to reduce regulation. Companies have a role to play in saying that's a good idea. Get rid of as much regulation it can, or saying this has gone too far. So ICCR members in general have been trying to stem the tide as the administration tries to get rid of regulation or tries to disempower the EPA so that it can't even mention the word climate change, for example. So there's multiple ways in which companies, Ann knows this well, where companies' voices are being heard. Some of them are very related to their business, Other times it's on a more general regulatory issue like shareholder resolution rights.
Thank you for that question, Ann. Thanks, John and Tim, for your response. Other questions? If you've got one, please unmute yourself.
I guess kind of a simple question, but also one that I guess could clarify more things for the members is you see that, in situations like Disney and Boeing, that the companies are reacting to these resolutions about lobbying and disclosures and other corporate governance questions. But does this make a difference for other companies? And how does the voice from organizations like ours make a difference on these issues?
Well, that's a great question, Natalie. Yes, I think when we see more and more companies actually beginning to do this disclosure or to deal with the issue of accountability, back to the point, it's not just about information, but taking your lobbying seriously and trying to put some values into it. As we watch successes with companies like AT&T or IBM, as that list gets bigger, we've actually had a couple of companies say, oh, Emerson Electric, for example, where Sister Barbara attended their meetings. Oh, we've got a representative from AT&T on our board. Oh, we'll learn more about what they've done. Or IBM's position is important to us. So I think that had a little bit of effect on Disney. And I think the more we can get big companies to be comfortable in expanding their level of transparency, the more others are going to find it hard to say, oh, we can't do that. Nobody does it, that we don't want to be out there by ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Natalie, and kind of gets at several ways that we're approaching this. And it constantly moves the bar as more and more companies disclose. But this gets at kind of our approach, which we currently have to go to companies and file shareholder proposals and go through dialogues. So private ordering, and we get agreements where companies agree to disclose a lot of what we're asking for. But there's a petition at the SEC that was filed in 2011. It's the most commented and supported petition they've ever received, over 1.2 million comments, saying that companies should be required to disclose their corporate political spending, political contributions, but then also donations and payments through trade associations. And that would create a level playing field that would take away this work that we've been doing and moving and getting a better standard. But at the end, a lot of companies say, oh, we want, a uniform set of disclosure, yet they lobby against our ability to file these proposals and to have this disclosure, but then they say they need that. So it's kind of this conundrum, but there's a way that if the SEC and there was a rule, we could get this information all in one fell swoop. But as it is, we're left trying to raise the bar and improve these disclosures through the shareholder proposal process.
John, as you mentioned, again, the action challenging our rights to file resolutions, I'll because I know time's getting tight, I'll just mention to Frank and Christopher that the trade associations that some of the investor groups are part of, the USCIF, which is the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investing, has just done a draft letter that would go to the SEC. It's an open letter that investors can sign. And while I know ICCR members have done a lot of this and signed other open letters, this is one that's sort of written not with a lot of detailed legal commentary, but more a general comment about that we don't think these changes are needed. So it's a different message, and I think it can be used with the press as such. So Frank and Christopher, maybe you could send that out to members that were on the call here, just say, because I think we've only got about 9 days or so or 10 days to sign up. That would be great.
That letter actually went in our e-newsletter to everybody this past week. So they've all had the opportunity to sign. If you haven't, just revisit that e-newsletter and you have the opportunity to do so.
So once again, you're ahead of the trends, Christopher.
Oh, I'm just trying to keep up with you and John. We are so grateful to have had with us our members present today, as well as Tim and John sharing from their experience and their understanding of this issue. And I hope that people have come away with a better technical understanding of why these issues are important. But if nothing else, come away too with the conviction that when you file a resolution like this, or when you co-file a resolution like this, you're not doing it alone. You have the support of the SGI team, but you also have the support and backing of two really deeply experienced and deeply committed individuals on this issue. And so if you haven't put your foot in these waters before, this is a great issue to do it around. We'll circulate to you the list of companies that Tim and John have identified as being particularly apt around this. And we can highlight some of the companies that are ones that are on the SGI engagement list in that especially. But, this is just a really essential issue that kind of connects into everything else that we do at the end of the day. So thank you for your time this morning. And maybe I'll conclude with one more quote from Justin Welby, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England. He said yesterday, "Money is not morally neutral. It can do harm and it can do good. At the very least, it is the responsibility of investors to take account of environmental, social, and governance factors in their investment decisions and in their stewardship of their assets." We are so very grateful for the leadership Tim and John give us in helping be good and responsible, active stewards of our assets, especially in these governance issues. And with that, I want to thank you for your time again today. We'll send out the slides, the video, and a link to an evaluation of this webinar, and we'd be grateful for your feedback. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you.